History is almost always written by the victors, but sometimes history is rewritten by the one man the victors forgot to kill. The year is 750 AD. Imagine a grand estate on the banks of the Euphrates River, tucked away in the fertile plains of Iraq. The Umayyad Dynasty, which had ruled the Islamic world for nearly a century from the grand city of Damascus, has just been toppled. A new power, the Abbasids, has risen with a singular, terrifying goal: total extermination of the old guard. To mark this new era, the Abbasids invited 80 Umayyad princes to a grand banquet of reconciliation. It was sold as a peace summit, a chance to heal the wounds of a bloody civil war and move forward as one. It was supposed to be a fresh start. Instead, it was a slaughterhouse. As the princes sat down to eat, the doors were barred from the outside. In a heartbeat, the atmosphere shifted from celebration to terror. Abbasid soldiers emerged from behind the tapestries, armed not with swords for a fair fight, but with heavy wooden clubs. They wanted to humiliate the dynasty as they destroyed it. One by one, the princes were bludgeoned. Legend says the Abbasid generals were so cold-blooded that they laid heavy leather shrouds over the piles of dying, gasping men and proceeded to finish their dinner on top of them, listening to the muffled groans of their rivals beneath the floorboards. In a single night, the Umayyad line was declared extinct. The black banners of the Abbasids were raised, and the world was told that the past had been buried. Or so they thought. Miles away, in a quiet, secluded village, a 20-year-old prince named al-Rahman heard the distant echoes of his family's destruction. He didn't wait for his horse, his servants, or his crown. He simply ran into the night. This wasn't just a retreat. It was the start of one of the greatest survival stories in human history. This is the story of the Falcon of Quraysh, a man who lost an empire in the east, became a penniless refugee, and against every law of probability, built a new superpower in the west that would outshine the world for centuries. To understand the scale of this feat, you have to understand the man. al-Rahman wasn't your typical pampered palace-dwelling prince. He was tall, lean, and athletic, possessing a striking shock of red hair, a trait inherited from his mother, a Berber princess from the tribes of North Africa. In 750 AD, those distinctive royal features were effectively a walking death sentence. Every guard at every checkpoint from Syria to the Nile had his description. The new Abbasid Caliph, a man who earned the terrifying nickname the Bloodshedder, had launched a global manhunt. He didn't just want the throne, he wanted the bloodline erased so thoroughly that no one would ever dare speak the name Umayyad again. The most harrowing moment of this hunt happened at the banks of the Euphrates River. al-Rahman had been hiding in a small tent with his younger brother Yahya and his young son. Suddenly the horizon turned black. It was the dust cloud of the Abbasid cavalry. With the soldiers closing in, the brothers had only one choice: the river. They plunged into the icy, churning waters, desperate to reach the other side. Halfway across, the Abbasid soldiers reached the bank and realized their prey was escaping. They changed tactics. They stopped their horses and began to shout out a tempting, hollow offer. "Come back, we promise you safety. We are your brothers in faith. We only want to talk." Yahya, younger, exhausted and terrified by the current, made a fatal mistake. He believed them. Despite Abd al-Rahman's desperate screams for him to keep swimming, Yahya turned back toward the shore. As soon as the boy's feet touched the sand, the soldiers grabbed him. Abd al-Rahman, still treading water in the middle of the river, was forced to watch as his younger brother was decapitated. The soldiers held the head up as a warning. Abd al-Rahman turned his back on the shore, turned his back on his former life, and kept swimming until his lungs burned. He was now the last of his house. He had no money, no army, and the most powerful empire on earth was hunting him across 3 continents. For 5 long years, he lived as a ghost. This part of his life is often glossed over in history books, but imagine the psychological toll. He wandered through the Sinai Desert, through the markets of Egypt, and across the scorching, endless sands of the North African Sahara. He slept in caves, disguised himself as a common laborer, and sought refuge among Bedouin tribes who lived so far off the grid that they didn't care for the politics of distant Baghdad. He was a prince who had been raised in marble palaces, now forced to survive on dates and brackish water, constantly looking over his shoulder for the glint of an assassin's blade. He survived on nothing but sheer grit and a singular, perhaps delusional obsession that he was a man of destiny. By 755 AD, his wanderings had brought him to the very edge of the known world, the coast of modern-day Morocco. He stood on the cliffs of the Maghreb and looked across the narrow, shimmering Strait of Gibraltar toward the Iberian Peninsula, Al-Andalus. At the time, Islamic Spain was a chaotic, beautiful, and dangerous mess. It was a frontier province, thousands of miles from the heart of the Caliphate, and it was tearing itself apart. Tribal wars between Arab factions and Berber settlers had turned the land into a patchwork of feuding warlords. The local governor, Yusuf al-Fihri, was a man who ruled by fear but lacked the authority to actually lead. To any rational observer, Spain looked like a disaster zone. To Abd al-Rahman, it looked like a vacuum waiting for a leader. But how does a lone refugee conquer a country? He didn't start with an army, he started with a message. He sent his most loyal servant, a man named Badr, across the sea with a simple pitch to the Syrian regiments stationed in Spain, men whose families had once served Abd al-Rahman's grandfather. The message wasn't, "I am coming to conquer you," it was, "I am a son of the caliphs. I am the blood of the house that gave you your pride. I am the only one who can stop the bickering and make you great again." In late summer of 755, a lone ship pulled into the harbor of Al-Muñeca. When Abd al-Rahman stepped onto the sand, the local lords were stunned. They had expected a conqueror with a fleet and a treasury. Instead, they got a man with nothing but the clothes on his back and a name. But that name carried the weight of a century of history. Thousands of soldiers, tired of the petty tribal wars, saw in him a symbol of the old, stable world. They didn't just see a fugitive, they saw a king. The governor, Yusuf al-Fihri, realized too late that this red-haired stranger was a lightning rod for revolution. He gathered a massive force to crush the uprising before it could truly begin. The two forces met on the banks of the Guadalquivir River, just outside the walls of Córdoba, in May of 756. The odds were heavily against the prince. His men were outnumbered and many were still skeptical. There is a famous story that on the morning of the battle, Abd al-Rahman noticed his soldiers whispering. They saw that he was riding a beautiful fast horse, and they feared that, if the battle went south, he would use that horse to gallop away and leave them to die. Hearing this, Abd al-Rahman did something extraordinary. He called for a common, slow brown mule and swapped his war horse for it. He told his army, "I have no desire for a fast horse, for I have no intention of retreating. Today we either win this land, or we die upon it." The Battle of Massacre was a masterclass in desperation and tactics. Abd al-Rahman's forces fought with the ferocity of men who had everything to gain and nowhere else to go. By the time the sun began to set, the governor's army had broken and fled. The gates of the great city of Córdoba swung open, and the man who had been swimming for his life in the Euphrates 5 years earlier was now the emir of Al-Andalus. But winning a battle is just the beginning of the story. The true genius of Abd al-Rahman, now known as Ad-Dakil, or the Entrant, was what he did after the swords were sheathed. He didn't just want to survive. He wanted to outshine his enemies in the east. He began a massive project to transform Spain into the cultural and intellectual heart of the world. He transformed the landscape literally and figuratively. He brought advanced Syrian irrigation techniques to the dry Spanish plains, introducing crops that we now associate with the Mediterranean: oranges, lemons, pomegranates, and palms. He began the construction of the Great Mosque of Córdoba, a forest of marble and jasper designed to rival the grandest temples of Damascus and Baghdad. Those iconic red and white striped arches were a direct nod to the architecture of his lost home. He also created a society that was, for its time, remarkably sophisticated. While the rest of Europe was struggling through what many call the Dark Ages, Córdoba was becoming a sanctuary for poets, scientists, and philosophers. He fostered an environment where different cultures and faiths had to coexist to keep the state running. He was building a golden age out of the ashes of his own tragedy. Back in the lavish courts of Baghdad, his greatest enemy, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur, was keeping a close eye on the west. There is a famous account of al-Mansur sitting with his advisors and asking them, "Who is the Falcon of Quraysh?" The courtiers, naturally wanting to please their master, replied, "It is you, O commander of the faithful." Al-Mansur shook his head. "No," he said, "it is Abd al-Rahman. I have the wealth of the East and a massive army behind me." But he wandered alone. He had no friends, no money, and no support. He crossed deserts and seas, and with nothing but his own willpower, he carved an empire out of a land of rebels. That is a man to be feared. When the man who spent a fortune trying to kill you gives you a nickname like the Falcon, you know you have secured your place in history. Abd al-Rahman. I ruled for 32 years. He survived dozens of assassination attempts, multiple revolts by disgruntled lords, and even an invasion attempt by the famous Charlemagne from the north. But through it all, he remained a man of deep, quiet melancholy. He had built a paradise in Spain, but he never forgot the home that had been taken from him. In his palace gardens, he planted a single palm tree, the first of its kind in Europe, grown from a seed smuggled from Syria. He famously wrote a poem to that tree saying, "You are like me, a stranger in a distant land, far from the soil where we were born. You grow in a place where you are not known, just as I rule a people who are not my own." He died in 788 AD, leaving behind a stable, prosperous, and powerful state. His dynasty would rule for nearly 3 centuries, and the Islamic influence in the Iberian Peninsula would last for nearly 800. He was the man who was supposed to be a forgotten footnote in the Abbasid success story, a prince who died in a river. Instead, he became the founder of a civilization that would eventually pass the torch of knowledge back to Europe, sparking the beginnings of the Renaissance. So, next time you see the stunning architecture of the Alhambra, or look at a map of the Mediterranean, remember that the course of history wasn't changed by a massive army or a grand treaty. It was changed by a 20-year-old boy who refused to give up, even when the whole world wanted him dead. If you found this story of the Falcon more engaging than a standard history lecture, make sure to let me know in the comments. We are moving away from the dry dates and lists of names to find the real, high-stakes drama of the Islamic empires. What should we look at next? The naval legends of the Mediterranean, the rise of the Janissaries, or perhaps the secret history of the assassins? The choice is yours. I'm Mogni Choudhury, and this is Islamic Empires. I'll see you in the next chapter.